Are here in the chapel, and hello to folks who are tuning in at home. As always, we welcome your participation in this class too. I will be monitoring comments on the Facebook live stream, so go ahead and say hello if you are tuning in. Let us know you can hear. So we are in week 6 of a series here in Adult Ed called Stories of Reconciliation. And each week we have been looking at a profile of different people who are living out the call to be God's agents of reconciliation in the world. And this series came out of a earlier series that Pastor Allison and I did in May, looking at the Confession of 1967, which is one of the statements of faith in our Book of Confession, which uses the motif of reconciliation to describe the work that God is doing in the world and the work that the church is called to carry out in our ministry. And so we have looked at stories of all different folks who are actually living out that idea that document in our Book of Confessions talks about. We looked at some of the work that is done by folks in our own congregation during the Cold War to talk about peacemaking with Russia, the story of our peace candle, the story of some other folks here in York who were working to try to humanize what was seen as an enemy population. We looked at the story of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, the work of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the work to try to move forward and bring about reconciliation after the atrocities of apartheid in South Africa. We had a special guest who talked to us via Zoom about the work of Christian peacemaker teams and their astonishing ministry of being a non-violent witness in the midst of conflict zones. And then last week we watched a video about the work of Thistle Farms, which is a ministry headed by an Episcopal priest that works to care for and bring healing to women who have been survivors of human trafficking. So we've been looking at all different ways that folks have been living out this ministry of reconciliation that our confessional document talks about. And so today we have a very special part in our series. As you probably know, today we are in worship honoring the ministry and the legacy of Faith Presbyterian Church, which was a historic Black Presbyterian congregation that merged with First Presbyterian in the 1960s. And our congregation has often been fond of lifting up the story of that merger as being a witness to reconciliation in the midst of a time when York itself was plagued with a lot of racist violence. And of course, that is a powerful witness. But we also have been realizing that that was not always a merger of equals, perhaps in the way that it should have been. And so today we are focusing on lifting up the work and the ministry of Faith Presbyterian Church, and parts of that story that some of us may not always know. And so today we have the exciting opportunity to watch this documentary called Celebrating Faith that is put together by some folks here in our congregation. It was directed and researched largely by Guy Dunham. The cinematography was done by Kyle Gorin. And this documentary series, we've been showing it one episode at a time in worship over the past several months. But we are excited to have the chance to actually watch the whole thing all together. So this documentary, Celebrating Faith, we are going to watch it, and then whatever time we have left over, we will have some chance for conversation. So folks who are tuning in at home, I am monitoring the comments on Facebook. You can share your thoughts there. After it's done, folks here in the room, we would love to hear your thoughts as well. So KG, we are going to go ahead and press play. This is Celebrating Faith.
Early records provide some insight into how our sister congregation was established. These records state in part,
sometime in May 1894, a small group of persons, 4 or 5, met at the home of Mrs. Susan Sanders in South Queen Street for the purpose of canvassing the sentiment as to the organization of a Presbyterian church for the colored people of York. It was known that some persons who had been members of Presbyterian churches in other communities and others felt that the worship and polity of the Presbyterian church would be helpful. Our church's name, Faith, as well as the venture to secure this property, was suggested by our now deceased but dearly beloved friend and Christian brother, Mr. Samuel Small.
During the late 1830s and 40s, several members of the prominent industrialist Small family transferred their memberships from the German Reformed Church to English Presbyterian. Rumors were that they were not happy with the seeming Southern sympathies of the pastor of their former congregation. They included brothers Philip and Samuel Small, and eventually their cousin, David Eder Small, who would later become rail car builder with business partner Charles Billmeyer. Holding an unpopular position in York County during those years leading up to the Civil War, these Small family members were known for their ardent abolitionist, anti-slavery sentiments. Only a decade after the Small family's gradual transfer to English Presbyterian, the congregation would call 3 pastors in a row who held and at times publicly expressed these unpopular sentiments as well. Trustee Philip A. Small was famously known as having to bail Reverend Thomas Street out of jail for having gotten into a fist fight with a Southern sympathizer right on Market Street. And having been so well known for his support of enslaved people seeking freedom, the Black Civil War soldiers in York made the highly unusual decision to name their post the David E. Small Post, number 369. Most likely it would have been an honor then for Reverend Dr. Henry E. Niles, pastor of English Presbyterian and longtime trustee of Lincoln University, to submit on behalf of the 70 signers a petition to the Presbytery of Westminster at its stated meeting on April 9, 1895, to declare Faith Presbyterian a duly constituted church. And it can be assumed that likewise on that day, the call for Reverend Edward A. Coburth, recent graduate of Lincoln University, was approved, and that he be installed as their pastor on June 18 of that same year. As history would show, along with other congregations such as Small AME, Bethel AME, and Shiloh Baptist, Faith Presbyterian would become a prominent and influential Black congregation in York for decades to come.
Happy day when Jesus washed, oh, when he washed, when Jesus washed, he washed my sins away. Oh, happy day, oh, happy day.
James Ralston Amos and his brother Thomas Henry were free Black farmers in Hensonville, Chester County, Pennsylvania, and trustees at the Hosanna African Union Methodist Protestant Church. It was a small congregation of other free Blacks, locally known for its abolitionist members and ties to the Underground Railroad. James wanted to study ministry, and so he asked for help from Presbyterian minister John Miller Dickey, pastor of a church in nearby Oxford. Dickey helped James apply to several seminaries, but his applications were all rejected. So moved by the young man's desire for an education so that he could better serve his congregation, Dickey decided to take matters into his own hands, invite James to his home, and tutor the young man himself. A few years later, John Dickey founded the Ashmun Institute. Modern-day historians note that James Amos, his brother Thomas, and their small Black community were just as instrumental in financing and building the institution, and therefore should be considered as co-founders with Dickey. Both Amos brothers would eventually be the first graduates of Ashmun and become ordained Presbyterian ministers. Opened to students on January 1, 1857, with 4 men, including James and Thomas, enrolled, Ashmun Institute got its name from Jehudi Ashmun, a religious leader and reformer involved with the American Colonization Society. The Institute was founded to support the education of African Americans at a time when higher education was essentially unattainable to them. According to alumnus Horace Mann Bond and the university's 8th president, it was, to quote, the first institution found anywhere in the world to provide a higher education in the arts and sciences for male youth of African descent, unquote. It would become the nation's first degree-granting historically Black college and university. A year after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1866, the school was renamed Lincoln University. The education it provided to African American males was strongly rooted in the teachings of the Presbyterian Church, with a rigorous curriculum being split into 3 areas: preparatory, academic, and theological. Due to these hallmarks, among others, the school was often referred to as the Black Princeton University. The academic department, a 4-year higher education program, taught biblical and classical studies, science, and philosophy. The theological department was a 3-year program that awarded students the degree of Bachelor of Sacred Theology. The college attracted highly talented students from numerous states, especially during the long decades of legal segregation in the South. Among the future graduates would be approximately 10 of the 12 installed pastors of Faith Presbyterian Church. In the same year in which the institution was renamed, the Board of Trustees increased in size from 9 members to 21. Among those who eventually would serve in this capacity was the Reverend Dr. Henry E. Niles, pastor of English Presbyterian, whose tenure on the board would span roughly 2 decades. As history shows, Lincoln University's close ties to English Presbyterian Church was also demonstrated by the fact that upon each of their deaths, Isabel Cassatt Small, the wife of Elder Samuel Small Jr., and Elder David Etter Small would each leave large sums of money to the university, with David E. Small's bequest amounting approximately the equivalent of $320,000 today. He was also known for financially aiding individual Black students who wanted to attend the school but could not afford it themselves. In addition, when the Sanctuary of English Presbyterian was remodeled in 1892, the organ being replaced was donated to the university, no doubt finding a new home in the Mary Dodd Chapel, which had been built only 2 years previously.
When Jesus washed, when he washed, when Jesus washed, he washed my sins away. Oh, happy day.
In December 1916, the Reverend Dr. W. Edward Williams, the seventh pastor of Faith Presbyterian Church since its founding in 1895, delivered an address to the Ministers Association of York, which would later be printed in its entirety in the York Gazette. He began by first asking his colleagues seated there before him this probing question: what is the problem with the colored people? In a bold and straightforward way, unheard of for such a time and place, he asserted that while the oppressive tactics of the South were far worse, those of the North, specifically in York County, were anything but non-existent, and certainly no less discriminatory. In part, he contended,
"It is almost impossible for a colored man, no matter how intelligent, wealthy, or moral, or what not he may be, to rent or purchase a home on a good street and in a respectable neighborhood. He is not denied because he is immoral, dishonest, unruly, unclean, or materially unable to meet the demands, but solely, simply, and only because he is a colored man. So he must herd in the alleys, live in a poor neighborhood, less convenient, less sanitary than he would choose. There is no restaurant, hotel, or boarding house in this city operated by white people where a colored person can eat a meal, not even a shoe shining parlor where he can have his shoes cleaned, be he ever so financially able or respectable. He is a colored man, and that alone bars him out. Would he be a mason, mechanic, a clerk, or a salesman? He is colored, and though ever so proficient, he cannot be employed. What store would employ his daughter, save to cook, sweep, or scrub? What business firm or house would open its doors to his son, though he graduated at the head of his class of a college where he was the only colored student, as more than one has done? Do these colored youths graduate of our own high schools and of the best colleges of the land want the advantages even of our so-called Christian institutions, such as our YM and YWCAs? Though they are Christians, they are denied. They may be in the same Christ with the white people, but they must not be in the same Christian institution. They are colored, and to be colored outweighs all progress, all attainments, all other possessions. You say the colored people must provide all these things for themselves. Is it right? Is it fair? Would such a demand be made of any other race variety? Do you say to the German, Irish, Greek, or any other, you can be entertained, employed, buy, and live on the same street with only those of your own race or class? The two greatest enemies to the progress of the colored people of America are the white press and the white ministry. The white press, because it seeks out and publishes in flaring headlines all the evil it can find of the race and makes no note of all the things which speak for the character and progress of the race. The white ministry, because it is silent on lynching, disenfranchisement, segregation, and all other social evils, where if they would speak out as their Bible teaches and their Christianity declares on the race question, they could do more than any other agency in the world to really better the condition of the colored people and honor the Christ.
When Jesus washed, oh, when he washed, when Jesus washed, he washed my sins away. Oh, happy day, oh, happy day.
In 1919, Reverend Dr. W. Edward Williams, along with members of Faith Presbyterian Church, celebrated the burning of the $4,000 mortgage of a building adjacent to the sanctuary. It was located at 52 North Duke Street. Purchased in 1917, the building had been acquired because Williams had noted that the black children of his community were not allowed to have access to the local YMCA. In the March 17, 1917 edition of the York Gazette, an article reported that a fundraising concert featuring the renowned Fisk Jubilee Singers would be held at the high school. It included the following description of the house.
The community house for the benefit of the colored people of this city has about been finished and is in charge of Reverend Dr. W. Edward Williams, pastor of Faith Presbyterian Church. Dr. Williams has had considerable experience in the YMCA work in Baltimore, where he was a minister of the gospel before he came to York more than a year ago. Reverend Dr. and Mrs. Williams reside in apartments on the second floor. The first room front has been equipped as a reading room, supplied with all the leading magazines and newspapers. It has also a good library. At the rear is a game room with the pool table installed. Shower baths have also been installed, and a dispensary is being fitted up where persons can be supplied with medical aid at certain times to be designated later. There is also an assembly room for the use of the Board of Directors, which is composed of both colored and white people of the city. The officers of the board are Dr. G.W. Bowles, Chairman, Dr. James A. Dale, Treasurer, and Reverend Dr. W. Edward Williams, Secretary.
Among those celebrating the burning of the mortgage in 1919 was Glenn Alvin J. Goodrich, Jr., chair of the Church Board of Trustees. He was also the grandson of the late freed slave, successful businessman, and Underground Railroad conductor, William C. Goodrich, and son of the late and renowned photographer, Glenn Alvin, and Rhoda Goodrich. Present as well was Samuel Small, son of the late Philip Albright Small, and nephew of the late Samuel and Isabel Small. His $500 donation had helped retire the mortgage. Such a gift was fitting, no doubt, in light of the fact that Samuel was instrumental in not only the founding, but also in the naming of Faith Presbyterian Church, along with the purchase of the congregation sanctuary in 1894, a year before it was even officially constituted as a congregation by the presbytery. Notably absent, however, was the pastor of First Presbyterian Church and close colleague of W.E. Williams, the Reverend Dr. Andrew Todd Taylor. There is no doubt Taylor would have been present at this significant occasion if he had been able. Tragically, at the time of the ceremony, he was suffering from neuralgia of the heart, a painful condition by which he would die a few months later, on December 21, at the age of 55. Other prominent citizens of the community were present. Notable industrialist A.B. Farquhar, along with pastors of local white congregations such as Christ Lutheran and St. John the Baptist Episcopal, made remarks. For years to come, the community house, a forerunner of Crispus Attucks York, itself founded in 1931 by board member Dr. George W. Bowles, along with Faith Presbyterian pastor Reverend Thomas Montooth, would prove to be an essential building in the community. The community house provided medical assistance, as well as opportunities of education, recreation, and fellowship for Black and white alike. Symbolic, perhaps, of what the members of Faith Presbyterian always hoped it would be, a model of racial equality and harmony.
When Jesus washed, oh, when he washed, when Jesus washed, he washed my sins away. Oh, happy day.
was on December 24, 1865, 30 years before the founding of Faith Presbyterian Church, and 100 years to the day of the congregation's historic merger with First Presbyterian, that this notorious white supremacist organization was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee. Its name, the Ku Klux Klan. Formed as a backlash to the demise of the Confederacy, by 1871, it would fade into the background due to U.S. government pressure, only to reemerge during the 1920s, aided by the well-known support of the nation's own president, Woodrow Wilson. In the years leading up to the Roaring '20s, lynching of Black Americans by the KKK had become so widespread in the South that in 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, was formed in New York City, with anti-lynching being its central agenda. By the end of the 1920s, the KKK would, once again, recess from public view until its reemergence in the 1950s due to the rise of the growing civil rights movement. Over the years, York County would become known as home to one of the most active Ku Klux Klan groups in all of Pennsylvania. As Jim Crow laws were unabashedly being practiced in York County, Faith Presbyterian Church called its 9th pastor in 1928. Born in Georgetown, British Guiana, and the maternal grandfather of First Presbyterian member Elaine Carr, Reverend Thomas E. Montooth attended high school in New York City, graduated from Lincoln University in 1912, and became a naturalized citizen in 1925. Being ordained as a Presbyterian minister, he served 2 congregations in Virginia before beginning his 10-year ministry at Faith only a year before the Great Depression hit. Having a deep concern for the Black residents of York, in 1931, Montooth would join Dr. George Bowles, former president of Faith Presbyterian's Community House, in forming what is now the nationally acclaimed York Crispus Attucks Association. Nonetheless, albeit a notable accomplishment on its own, this is not what Reverend Thomas E. Montooth is best known for. Rather, it was his ardent civil rights activism. When he first arrived in York, he made it clear, quote, "If you are not willing to stand up for civil rights, you should step aside and get out of the way of those who are ready and willing to move," unquote. While short and slim in stature and characterized by some as having a compelling voice laced with a distinct Caribbean accent, Thomas Montooth is recognized as one of York's earliest giants in regard to those who have faithfully fought for the civil rights of all, and in particular, the city's Black community. Numerous times he would advocate for Black residents who were unlawfully arrested or charged. Eventually, he would become the president of the local NAACP chapter, established in 1944. In 1947, he was famously known for filing discrimination charges against the owner and an employee of a local restaurant for not serving him simply because he was Black. The case eventually would go to a grand jury. But in spite of the fact that 2 York City police officers were called to witness on Montooth's behalf, and that he was represented by the district attorney himself, the jury did not find the 2 defendants guilty of violating the state equal rights law. Instead, the jurist threw the case out and placed court costs upon Montooth himself. Disappointed but not deterred, Thomas Montooth later released a public statement in which he asserted his determination to defend his civil rights, stating, "Should I encounter any infringement of my civil rights or privileges, I shall again seek legal justice in the manner provided by law." As time would show, Thomas E. Montooth did, in fact, continue standing up for his own as well as the civil rights of all York citizens up until his death in October 1977, at the age of 91. His funeral service was officiated by First Presbyterian Associate Pastor Leary Chase in the John Calvin Chapel, and he was appropriately laid to rest alongside many of Faith Presbyterian's charter members and others in what is now the well-known and historic Black Lebanon Cemetery.
When Jesus washed, oh, when he washed, when Jesus washed, he washed my sins away. Oh, happy day.
After Thomas E. Monteith's retirement in 1938, Faith Presbyterian was served by a series of 5 supply pastors. But it would not be until 1956 when a young seminary student who was a senior at Lincoln University arrived to serve Faith Presbyterian, bright and engaging in personality, as well as having a keen intellect. Jason Jerome Cooper was called to, ordained, and installed at the church the following year. Monteith was present on that joyous day in 1957, noting that it had been 18 years since Faith had had an installed pastor. In that same year, Jerry, as he was affectionately known, would marry a beautiful young woman who was a member of Faith, Capitola Darrell Hall. The following year, on June 29, 1958, he would lead the congregation in a special service to dedicate the new stained glass windows that had been installed in the front and sides of the sanctuary, as well as in the community house, along with a new outdoor bulletin board, some new lighting, and a number of other items. By the end of 1960, the congregation retired 2 large debts. A letter from Senate Executive Douglas Vance commended the congregation, stating, "It is a notable achievement, and I am sure your people can feel justifiable pride in this milestone." However, the sanctuary was badly in need of renovations, and dwindling attendance numbers and finances raised growing concerns. Nonetheless, while no doubt carrying a heavy burden in regard to the struggles of the congregation he had come to love, Cooper not only faithfully continued to minister to his flock, but in the greater York community as well. During his 7-year pastorate, he served as vice president and then for 3 years as president of the Board of Crispus Attucks, ironically during a time when the 30-year-old organization was in the midst of its own dark period, even considering merger with the York YMCA. In 1961, 45 years after Reverend Dr. W.E. Williams' famous address to the York Ministerial Association, Jerome became the first Black clergyman to be elected as its president. In addition, he served on the executive committee of the local NAACP, the Board of the United Way of York, the York County Council of Community Services, the York City Police Advisory Board, and the York City Charter Committee. Unfortunately, in spite of his strong preaching skills, his contagious personality, and enthusiasm for ministry, Jerome Cooper eventually discovered the profound, debilitating impact that almost 2 decades of inconsistent pastoral leadership had had on this once vibrant and community-engaged congregation. Conversations, albeit not public, of the possible need to merge with another Presbyterian congregation had begun within 3 years of his installation as a pastor. And so, in 1963, at the January meeting of the Presbytery of Donegal, the motion to dissolve Jerome's pastoral relationship with Faith Presbyterian so that he might accept the call to the 770-member Berean Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia, was approved. The historic Black congregation was founded in 1880, with one of its founders being the famous Underground Railroad conductor, author, and educator, William Still. Only a few hours after delivering his final sermon on Sunday, February 24, Jerome was honored by over 100 members of both the Black and white community of York. In presenting a plaque sponsored by 7 different organizations, William Barber said Jerome was being honored in this way and by so many because his service had extended far beyond the limits of his church. No doubt the same would be said of Jason Jerome Cooper throughout the rest of his 32-year ministry at Berean and another 11 years at New Spirit Community Presbyterian Church. When Jerome unexpectedly died of a heart attack on December 29, 2007, at the age of 77, his obituary, published in the Philadelphia Tribune, noted that he had received many citations, trophies, awards, and honors presented at the local, state, and national levels, as when the city of Philadelphia joined Berean in a tribute for his many contributions to his city and to his church. In addition, the U.S. House of Representatives also provided a tribute to him, published in the Congressional Record on behalf of the entire Congress. And earlier in that same year, the Pennsylvania House of Representatives cited Jerome as a humanitarian of the highest magnitude as a result of his leadership throughout his career. Equally notable, perhaps, he also met and had become a friend with Bishop Desmond Tutu, was a guest at 10 Downing Street in London, England, and had an audience with Pope John Paul II in Rome, Italy. Yet, when all is said and done, it has been perhaps rightly noted that through his many accomplishments, whether with noble members of society or persons on the street, Jerome remained ever steadfast and a true servant of God, and thereby living out his life's motto, dare to struggle, dare to win.
When Jesus washed, oh, when he washed, when Jesus washed, he washed my sins away. Oh, happy day.
Well, that film is powerful. It's powerful when we watched it in tiny increments in worship over the last 2 months, but I think it's especially striking seeing the whole thing in continuity. And I'm reminded of this line from the Confession of 1967. The members of the church are emissaries of peace and seek the good of all in cooperation with powers and authorities in politics, culture, and economics. But they have to fight against pretensions and injustices when these same powers endanger human welfare. Their strength is in their confidence that God's purpose, rather than human schemes, will finally prevail. And I think we see a witness to that confidence that God's purposes will prevail in the ministry of the congregation of Faith Presbyterian Church. So we have about 10 minutes, and I would just love to hear from both those in the room and on Facebook, those who are watching the live stream. What about this documentary especially struck you? What do you want to talk about? I know there's a lot here.
I keep thinking about what else was happening behind the scenes.
Yeah.
What was the church thinking about, Faith Presbyterian Church thinking about the struggles they were engaged in?
thank you for that, Eve. I hope the folks at home could hear that. But yeah, wondering about what's going on behind the scenes, both in the world outside and within the congregation.
How passionately we love our churches, right?
Right.
Where we worship and have community. I think there's a struggle and a pain there that is indescribable.
Yeah.
I wouldn't understand, but I think it's worth like, probably what we'll do today, right? Deal with it.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I'm struck by our ignorance, that when I became a foster mom to an African-American teenager, was the first that I experienced some of the discrimination that happens in other people's lives every day. And for us to just live day to day completely unaware, and not that we're refusing to hear, but we just don't know. So I'm grateful for opportunities just to hear people's experience.
Yeah, how much we just don't know about other people's experiences and experiences of discrimination. And I'm so struck in watching this video by how enduring those experiences are. And that, you know, things may look one way in one particular moment in history, and they might look slightly different at a different moment in history, but how much continuity there is. How so many of those same problems and hatreds and discriminations have such a long legacy. Folks at home, we'd love to hear your thoughts as well. You can share in the chat on Facebook if anything caught your attention.
There's a lot to be concerned about, and there's a lot of sadness. I am also struck by the power of words, and some of which were really quite prophetic. And speaking up matters.
Yeah, absolutely. The power of prophetic words.
Sometime I'd love for us to unpack the article that the, I'm gonna draw a blank on his name, pastor wrote in the paper. I'd love for us to unpack that, read it.
Yes.
Together, perhaps, 'cause we just changed the date to June 19th, 2022, and there's nothing different. I just made a note to myself to try to find that article, because I think I'd like to read it.
Yeah.
I really agree with that, and maybe we can make that available on a website or whatever. I certainly would like to believe that, the one thing I did find curious was the lawsuit that was, the Reverend did not prevail. Even though clearly the restaurant people were breaking the law. That, to me, was curious, and I would certainly hope today our legal system is in better shape. But
Right.
when you look at the disproportionate amount of people of color in jail, and you do still scratch your head on that one too.
Yeah.
So,
That we have this hope that good will win in the end, but we do not always see that. And that reminds me of this. I'm going to read another paragraph from the Confession of 1967 that I think speaks a little bit to that. God has created the peoples of the earth to be one universal family. In his reconciling love, God overcomes the barriers between sisters and brothers and breaks down every form of discrimination based on racial or ethnic difference, real or imaginary. The church is called to bring all people to receive and uphold one another as persons in all relationships of life, in employment, housing, education, leisure, marriage, family, church, and the exercise of political rights. Therefore, the church labors for the abolition of all racial discrimination and ministers to those injured by it. Congregations, individuals, or groups of Christians who exclude, dominate, or patronize others, however subtly, resist the Spirit of God and bring contempt on the faith which they profess. So this confession speaks to, I think, a lot of what we saw in this video of the church's call to work for the reconciliation of the human family that God made. But it also is honest about the ways that individuals and groups do resist that Spirit of God.
In fact, misinterpret and kind of use it against.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I would also love to read, more at length some of these letters that were quoted from, because they are powerful. Yeah.
This problem of people being left out of society is true all over the world.
Right.
Because in Japan, there was a certain group of people that were isolated from everybody. I don't know if people can learn from them or work with them.
Yeah, we do. We see these dynamics. They look slightly different, but the same underlying problem. We see it all over the world.
Lord, make me an instrument of your peace is what's in my head right now. So I think
Yes.
that might be my motto
Amen.
moving forward. Let me be
Amen.
an instrument of your peace.
What a simple but powerful prayer. Well, as we prepare to go and worship and pray that prayer, as we praise and worship God, let me read one final line from the Confession of 67 in closing. To be reconciled to God is to be sent into the world as God's reconciling community. This community, the Church Universal, is entrusted with God's message of reconciliation and shares God's labor of healing the enmities which separate people from God and from each other.